How did it happen that a man of Ethiopian stock came to be thought as the savior of Christian Europe? Why is it that the Europeans put millions of man hours into finding the specific person so that they can be saved from their rivals? Well, it starts with a man who lives very close to the Ethiopians, Muhammad. Muhammad's armies grew fast and they moved into Africa and Europe swiftly. And then Europe found itself just taken over by Middle Eastern and African people, and they were at their mercy. But slowly they started to develop a thought that someone somewhere outside of their continent of Europe was going to help them, and his name was Prester John. This was not purely coming out of the head of people who thought of things as fiction or were confused by mythology, but by the fact that Muslims from time to time would deplete from areas of Europe. A lot of this could be due to plagues, and some of it could be due to actually other religions that would call for Muslims to return to their lands. The funny part is that the Muslims themselves were helped by Christian Ethiopia in order to expand into Christian territories. This would sustain for a long time, but the Christians would end up fighting with the Muslims in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian king that saved the Muslim armies from persecution did not realize what a struggle there would be between Ethiopia and places like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Somalia for power and the hearts of the religious. Peace was not something that could be sustained forever. Now, Prester John might have never even existed, but this did not stop Europe from requesting other Ethiopians who actually went to Europe, particularly Spain, and started embassies there so that they could help as best they knew how. For example, Wedem Arad. Wedem Arad was a king in the Solomonic dynasties of Ethiopia, and he sent 30 men to Spain seeking to strike a deal against the Muslims. This being brought up because he had heard through very good details of accounts, because he always had people in all areas, that the people of Al Andalus, the Muslims of Al Andalus, were defeated by the Christians. And he wanted to start an alliance that said that both of them were going to fight against the Muslims and call each other's armies in times when the Muslims would come to fight. And so Ethiopians would be called in Europe or in Spain, and the Spaniards would be called to Ethiopia. This mutual agreement would make it so that they would always find themselves in a higher position than the Muslims, since they both defeated the Muslims at one time. By the time of this Ethiopian king, the Muslims had already been devastated by another man who was thought to be Prester John, but turned out to be Genghis Khan and his descendants. Now, this did not help because he had no real interests in helping Christianity.
There is no evidence that he really had a big interest in hurting it either, but he did help them involuntarily by crushing most of the Muslim states, giving time to the Europeans, and perhaps even making it easier for the Europeans to take back Al Andalus.
Ong Khan was a Nestorian Christian, and this was why he was associated with Prester John. One European claimed that Ong Khan was one of the same with Prester John. Now, we all know that Marco Polo is not one to be trusted in all ways. In fact, it's thought that some of the stories he told, he was just told by other people. But if we take what he said, he gave a pretty unique account of Prester John, making similarities to him and Ong Khan. As we read, the circumstances under which these Tartars first began to exercise dominion shall now be related. They dwelt in the northern countries of Jarza and Bargu, but without fixed habitations, that is, without towns or fortified places, where there were extensive plains, good pasture, large rivers, and plenty of water. They had no sovereign of their own, and were tributary to a powerful prince, who, as I have been informed, was named in their language Ong Khan, by some thought to have the same signification as Prester John in ours. To him these Tartars paid yearly the tenth part of the increase of their cattle. In process of time the tribe multiplied so exceedingly that Un Khan, that is to say, Prester John, becoming apprehensive of their strength, conceived the plan of separating them into different bodies, who should take up their abode in distinct tracts of country. With this view also, whenever the occasion presented itself, such as a rebellion in any of the provinces subject to him, he drafted 3 or 4 in the 100 of these peoples to be employed on the service of quelling it, and thus their power was gradually diminished. He, in like manner, dispatched them upon other expeditions, and sent among them some of his principal officers to see that his intentions were carried into effect. Now, I did mention that Marco Polo was a liar, right? And so his words here might also be fiction, because there is no proof that Ong Khan himself was a Christian, though there were Tartars and other people from that area of the world that were Nestorian Christian monks, Nestorian Christians. But this is neither here nor there, because there were Indians who were thought to be Prester John and other people. You can see here that he's almost making the full claim that this is the Prester John people were looking for. With other Europeans finding this out, the name had to move. He couldn't have been in Asia, because in Asia there is really heathenism and Islam and other things of that nature. And so he moved to a definite Christian state, which was Ethiopia. But I want to stress, they did not take this as a joke. They did not see this as like a small thing that doesn't matter. They saw this as a full reality. Like I said, spending tons of money to go find these people. Vasco da Gama was looking for Prester John, both in Ethiopia and in India. And the Portuguese that landed in the Kingdom of Congo said they were going to find Prester John. But why is it that they didn't find him? Is it because he never existed? Now, that could be the answer, but maybe this Prester John was just a stand in name for some person who was going to save them, a Christian from the outside. Now, without any real reality, they needed to connect him to someone. And so they connected him to one of the magi. One of the magi was thought, and in the case of Ethiopia, it was the Ethiopian one, was thought to be, had kids in Ethiopia, and those kids grew up in Ethiopia, and now the Prester John is one of his descendants. A great story, but all of that is complete fiction. And it's actually surprising that they took this seriously. Now, it's not that this story is important in itself, but it does tell you how the people viewed the Ethiopians in Europe as far as Spain and even Italy. They did not see Africans as backwater or as if they were tribal or anything. They saw people as if they were sophisticated, and they were quite disappointed in some of the tribes they ran into. And sometimes they would land somewhere in Africa and go, well, this can't be where Prester John is from because it's not as sophisticated as we thought it was. In other places, when it was sophisticated, they realized that the people weren't even slightly Christian, and they were like, yeah, he's not here either. While in Mozambique, Vasco da Gama realized that he might have reached the land of Prester John. One thing that gave him a clue was the fact that half of the island of Mozambique was Muslim and the other half was Christian. As we read, shoals, that there were many cities along the coast, and also an island, one half populated of which consisted of Moors, and the other half of Christians who were at war with each other. This island was said to be very wealthy. We were told, moreover, that Prester John resided not far from this place, that he held many cities along the coast, and that the inhabitants of those cities were great merchants and owned big ships. The residence of Prester John was said to be far in the interior and could be reached only on the back of camels. These Moors had also brought hither two Christian captives from India. This information and many other things which we heard rendered us so happy that we cried with joy and prayed God to grant us health, so that we might behold what we so much desired in this place and island of Mozambique. In one of my previous videos, I touched on how the people who landed in the Kingdom of Congo mentioned Prester John and that they thought they were very close as well. These people predated Vasco da Gama. And of course, I showed you that painting by the Japanese of Prester John. But that's not important anymore. That is just a summary of Prester John. Actually, there's a whole mythology surrounding Prester John and how deep it went and how much investigation they did to try and find him and how sad it was when they realized they were chasing a dream. Before the present days, before the white man landed on our shores, we had relative peace. There were small battles, but eventually, realizing that we all had the same customs, we would come to some kind of agreement. We created great states where we would trade and talk and think about expanding our territories in a peaceful way. But after the ships came, everything changed. Brothers were blind to each other.